Welcome to the Agile Shop, where we talk shop about hands-on Agile solutions. In this video, we'll talk about what Scrum metrics to implement as a new Scrum Master. If you just started as a Scrum Master, or you just joined a new team, and you're not sure what metrics you should start tracking for your team, this video is for you. In this video, we will cover 3 main Agile metrics you should implement right away for your teams. We will define each metric and discuss how to use them. The metrics we will cover today are velocity, capacity, and burndown charts. Let's start with velocity. By definition, velocity is the amount of work a team can complete within a given time period, usually a sprint. It is measured by adding the sizes of all the user stories that are completed by the end of the sprint. A user story is either done or not done. The business or product owner only receives value when a user story is fully complete. This is why velocity does not include the sizes of numbers of partially completed user stories. Velocity measures what was delivered, and not the value of what was delivered. Velocity is a popular metric used in many Agile practices. Velocity is usually visualized as a bar graph, with the unit of measure on the vertical axis and the sprints on the horizontal axis. Velocity is tracked in the same unit the team uses to plan the work. The most common unit of estimation in Agile are the story points. If you're not familiar with the story points, check out the other video we created on story points. You should see it in the top right side of your screen. Velocity usually varies the most in the first few sprints and then begins to stabilize. It's less predictable during the early iterations since the team needs some time to test their approach, methods, and familiarize themselves with the project. Velocity is essential for sprint planning and release planning. Once a team has tracked their velocity over multiple sprints, they can use their velocity to estimate when the next releasable milestone or project will be done. Let's look at some examples on how velocity can be used for sprint planning and release planning. Let's say all your user stories are estimated in story points. Your team started the sprint with 10 user stories, and all user stories are different sizes, as shown right here. The total of user stories add up to 31 story points. You just finished your sprint and 9 out of 10 user stories were complete. The user story that was not complete has an estimated value of 5 story points. Your velocity for this sprint is 26 story points. That is because we had to subtract the entire 5 story points from your total of 31. As mentioned earlier, only the fully done user stories are counted towards your velocity without any partial completed user stories. So now we know your sprint 1 velocity is 26 story points. This information is critical for planning future sprints. Now let's say you continue to track your velocity for future sprints, and sprint 2 is 33 story points. Sprint 3 is 28, sprint 4 is 29, and sprint 5 is 29 story points again. This information comes in handy when trying to predict releases. So now let's take a look on how we can answer questions like how many sprints will it take to deliver a milestone? Or when will this be done? For predicting releases, velocity is most useful when expressed in a range. With the help of our data from the 5 sprints, we now know our range is 26 to 33 story points. Using a range allows us to be accurate without being overly precise. Now that we know our velocity range, let's look at an example of predicting the release. Let's say our product owner communicates to us the next milestone, and the product release needs to include 5 features. After estimation, feature A is 13 story points, feature B is 34 story points, feature C is 21 story points, D is 21 story points, and E is 13. That comes up to a total of 102 story points. With our lowest velocity of 26, it will take us 4 sprints, and with our highest velocity of 33 story points, it will take us about 3 sprints. With the information we know up to this point, our answer to the product owner is that it will take us 3 to 4 sprints to release all the 5 features. By using a range, we can communicate our uncertainty. Now you see why velocity is a must-have metric that every Scrum Master needs to track for their Scrum teams. Now let's look at capacity. By definition, capacity is an estimate of the total amount of the Scrum team time available for a given sprint. One of the first activities during the sprint planning is determining the available capacity for the team. Knowing the capacity allows the Scrum team to know what they can deliver that sprint. Let's say your team is doing a 2-week sprint. We should acknowledge that not all 10 business days will be dedicated towards the active sprint execution. There are a lot of factors that impact the team's capacity and takes away time from the teams completing user stories that we need to take into that consideration. Let's take a look of what are those other factors. There are the sprint activities like sprint planning, sprint review, sprint retrospective, and backlog refinements. Usually, there are other enterprise activities outside of the sprint. They will still require your team's time. We should reserve some buffer time against things not going quite as planned. Plus, consider the personal time off for each Scrum team member. These are the biggest activities that occur during the active sprint. Assuming the team is using story points as their estimation method, determining capacity is the same as predicting our team's target velocity for the upcoming sprints. To make this determination, start with the first sprint velocity, which in our case is 26 story points. If you have velocity data from multiple sprints, use the velocity range. In our case, if we average out the velocity for all the 5 sprints, our velocity average comes up to 29 story points. You want to consider if the new sprint will be different from a previous sprint. If your new sprint doesn't have big changes in the factors mentioned earlier, you can use your last sprint or sprint average velocity as your capacity. If the future sprint is different from your last sprint, for example, maybe there's a big holiday like Christmas and New Year's. Let's say that leaves us with 1 week out of the 2-week sprint. In this case, our capacity should be adjusted to half the story points. The idea here is to adjust the capacity in story points for the future sprints based on how the factors discussed change from sprint to sprint. Keep in mind the adjustment doesn't need to be perfect. Keep it high level and don't try to over-engineer. Every sprint you adjust based on your lessons learned. Now, let's look at the burndown charts and how they're used. A burndown chart is a graphical representation of the work that's left to do versus the time left. It can be used to show the work needed to be done for a project or an active sprint. This metric is popular in Scrum and is used by most teams to track their progress during the active sprint. A typical burndown chart shows the estimated effort in time or user stories on the vertical axis and the time in days on the horizontal axis. The burndown chart will display an ideal progress line and an actual progress line. As work is completed, the actual progress, also called the estimated work remaining line, on the chart will move downward, reflecting the smaller amount of work that still needs to be done. Let's use our sprint 1 example from earlier. If we start our 2-week sprint with 26 story points, the vertical axis will show the story points with the top displaying 26. The horizontal axis will show the sprint days, in our case 2 weeks, which are 10 business days. Once the sprint starts, every day that goes by, the burndown red line moves to the right. Assuming our user stories are estimated in story points, the story point value that a user is given or assigned, when the story is completed, the burndown chart will go down by the same value. If a 2 story point user story is complete from our sprint, our burndown line will go down by 2 story points, and the remaining user stories should show 24 user stories on the left side of the chart. A burndown chart can also go up, which usually is not a good thing. This happens if a user story is inserted into the sprint after the sprint has already started. For example, if we insert a 5 story point in the sprint, the burndown line will go up by the same number, and the story points remaining should show now 31. This means our scope has increased for our sprint. The velocity, capacity, and burndown charts are 3 core metrics that every Scrum Master should use with their teams. In summary, the velocity allows the Scrum Master to plan and forecast product releases and milestone delivery. The capacity allows the Scrum Master to identify how much scope the Scrum team should sign up for every sprint during the sprint planning meeting. And finally, the burndown chart shows the progress and work left for an active sprint or project. The velocity, capacity, and burndown charts are 3 core metrics that every Scrum Master should use with their teams. In future videos, we will discuss how to use these metrics in tools like Jira. Make sure you subscribe to our channel for future content. Thank you for watching.